Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Mike McGinn, Executive Director of America Walks, and we're glad you're going to join us for our latest webinar, Safe Street Design, the latest. This is a regular webinar series we put on. It is supported by Active People Healthy Nation and the Centers for Disease Control, which supports our work on educating people about safe street design because walkable places have a tremendously valuable health benefit in fighting long-term disease. And we'd all benefit from more walkable places. And so we're really going to go straight to that topic today, which is take a look at what can we do to make existing streets safer and redesign them for safety, and what is the best practice on this. And we have with us today from Toole Design, Jeremy Chrzan. He's the Multimodal Design Practice Lead. He'll do a presentation. Then we'll follow up with myself and Abdullahi, our board member, to field your questions. So we're going to have about half the time for presentation, about half the time for questions. So we want to thank all our partners. Of course, I called out Active People Healthy Nation and CDC, and we're also proud to have Toole Design as a supporter, as well as others who have supported our work in the past year. By the way, we also consider the individual donations that people make to America Walks to be critical as well. So if you're not yet a supporter, please consider doing so, and we'll talk about that at the end too. Um, so jumped ahead a little bit here. Did I miss a slide on the here we go. Housekeeping. If you have a question, there will be a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. Put your question in there. Abdullahi and I and our staffer, Madeline, behind the America Walks conference room, will be helping field those and prioritizing those. And the webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to our channel. So with that, let's see. Yeah, let's turn it over to Jeremy and go from there.
All right, hello everyone. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, you should all be seeing my screen, right?
Looks good.
All right, great. Well, thanks for having me. Good morning and good afternoon. In talking with the folks from America Walked, we talked about today's discussion being sort of geared towards designers and designing for safety, but also giving you some of the tools if you're an advocate when discussing streets with your local and regional agencies. So I will say right up front, I'm going to move really quickly through a lot of slides. I'd much rather have a discussion and hear what questions you all have and give you the information that I can towards the end. So with that, let's dig in. So I've been in the transportation industry for over 25 years now, and although funding for streets and safety is actually quite high, the streets really aren't getting safe enough quickly enough. And that really shows in the numbers. Nearly 41,000 people died on our streets in 2023. Just let that sink in for a minute and then realize that millions were injured each year. We did see some slight reductions in deaths from 2022 to 2023, both for motorists and pedestrians. But at these types of abysmal numbers, it really doesn't make it easy for the thousands of family members who lose a loved one, nor the many millions whose lives are changed due to severe injury. And so, in looking at street design and looking at what's working and what's successful around the world, it's clear that a safe system approach to street design is what's needed to genuinely affect safety. And this means improving this culture around the idea of safety. So, from the roadway design side of things, that means safer, slower roads that prevent a person from being killed or injured if a crash does occur. But it also talks about the important parts of improving vehicles and training for everyone that's actually using our roads. Another important takeaway from the safe system approach is that Safety needs to be proactive. We shouldn't be waiting to address safety after somebody dies. Yes, we should address existing high crash areas and look at our roads and identify where crashes are likely to occur. But there's lots of places where we probably have close calls and a crash just simply has not happened. And we can identify those things before something happens. So really addressing safety in a proactive way. So why are we kind of failing at safety in the United States? As I said, vehicles and drivers is one of those things. I'll spend most of my time today talking about the roadway design piece, but I'd be remiss to not talk about the vehicles. Um, this is an area where we've seen an increase in the size of vehicles, which means larger blind spots, more weight. So when a crash does happen, that tends to be a more severe or fatal crash. And so what can we on the agency side of things do to affect these pieces? Well, one thing we can do on the agency side is when purchasing the vehicle fleet for those agencies, the DOTs and the city fleets, we can be deliberate about the types of vehicles that we're purchasing. Beyond that, we can also influence what types of vehicles are used on our roadway construction projects. So simple things like for larger vehicles, specifying that those vehicles that are making deliveries or being used on site, those have to have side guards to reduce the likelihood of a pedestrian or bicyclist being pulled under that vehicle in a collision and seriously or fatally killed. These are things that places like Boston and the surrounding communities are doing and things that can be replicated across the country. So if you're one of those people that has to prepare construction specifications or help to identify city policies, then you can make a difference when it comes to safer vehicles in that regard. Moving on to design, um, it's typical for a designer to cite something called the AASHTO Green Book. That's something that engineers use and follow for roadway designs, and is often the thing cited as why we can't do something on a project. But in reality, the AASHTO suite of design guides gives us a lot of design flexibility to tailor a street design to meet our established project goals. And the Green Book is explicit in stating that good highway design involves balancing safety, mobility, and the preservation of scenic, aesthetic, historic, cultural, and environmental resources, and reinforces that sufficient flexibility is permitted to encourage independent designs that are tailored to the particular situation. Too many engineers use this guide as a detailed manual of standards, even though it explicitly says not to do that. So that's one important thing that we can be doing. Things discussed in that guide are also open to a lot of interpretation. One of the things that could have a significant effect on safety is the width of our lanes, that many lanes have historically been built in that 11 to 14 foot wide range. Even the old AASHTO bike guides encouraged 14-foot wide lanes with the understanding that that would be more beneficial for vehicular cyclists. That doesn't actually pan out when you look at the research, though, and that historically we can identify that narrower lanes tend to actually be safer. It also used to be that you had to jump through a lot more hurdles if you were proposing narrower lanes. But many years ago, FHWA did away with the requirement for a design exception for lanes that didn't meet certain criteria. So we actually do have a lot more flexibility to narrow those lanes, and they're not required. They're also not required to accommodate the widths of vehicles that by and large vehicles are 7 to 8, 8.5 feet wide for the widest. And so when you look in the AASHTO Green Book, it talks about the operating width really only needing to be 9 and 10 feet wide. And there's plenty of examples around the country where 9, 9.5, 10-foot lanes are used even with heavy transit use. And then when we can narrow the widths of lanes, that contributes to lower operating speeds on those vehicles. And that's what we know over and over again that if we can lower the speeds of motor vehicles, we can reduce the severity of crashes if and when they do occur. And so in FHWA's Achieving Multimodal Networks Guide, we said explicitly that narrow lanes can contribute to lower speeds when they're integrated as part of an urban street design. So it's not just the narrow lanes, it's the other things, but it all adds up to a safer street. And as I said, narrow lanes are allowed, and the research is really telling us that they lead to safer outcomes on our streets. So this study from Johns Hopkins is the newest of the suite of research that has come out and really drives home the point that even though the agencies are allowed to do these things, they're largely not, but they should be because it benefits safety. So as I look around the country, there's a number of examples where narrower lanes exist. This one popped out recently to me in Bloomington. These are 11-foot wide lane, or no, sorry, 10-foot wide lanes from face of curb to the yellow line. And one of the reasons that's often cited as a need for wider lanes is for transit or large vehicle operations. But sometimes that information is being taken out of context. Why do we actually need 11 feet to accommodate those wider vehicles? Well, the reason is to try to avoid things like mirror strikes. But in this situation, on the left-hand side of the road, you can see a transit stops there, but there's also a separated bike lane there. So there's a buffer that mirrors can overhang over without striking anything. We don't actually need the 11 feet of paved width. We just need 11 feet of space that isn't going to have obstruction. So really thinking about what was the intent of design guidance can really affect the safety outcomes. This is another location. I drive through it all the time. It's East-West Highway in Prince George's County. This is a location where it goes over Sligo Creek, and even though it's an SHA road, it narrows it down to narrower lanes, and in this case, 9 feet on the right-hand side. And I can tell you, having driven through here, every time you go through here, you tend to slow down because it is a little less comfortable to drive quickly. And so it does get some of that driver behavior. Sidewalk widths is also another thing that I think gets overlooked in terms of street safety. Oftentimes, agencies are doing the bare minimum, 4 foot wide with the 5 foot passing areas to meet the accessibility criteria. But when we provide 6 feet, it's going to create that environment where people can comfortably walk next to each other. When we have sidewalks right up against the curb, it means people aren't hanging out over the edge of the roadway. And it also makes it safer for children like the one on the right-hand side to be in that space and not have a safety concern. As a person with the 7-month-old puppy, I can tell you that my dog is skittish when he hears a truck or a bus. And so I have to deliberately avoid some of the streets in my neighborhood because they're right up against the edge of the curb line and very narrow. And the same thing holds true for somebody who's walking with a small child. The widths can inform how safe and comfortable that is. Similarly, access to transit, like the photo on the right, the access board does require that accessible routes be provided that connect to transit stops. But beyond that, we also know that we need 8 feet of space to board and alight passengers on a bus. Providing that space also means that somebody isn't standing in the middle of the sidewalk and blocking people that are trying to walk past and, avoiding them having to step down into the road to get around people that are using that space. And beyond that, maintenance and things like that also are really going to affect safety. Even when you have 5 feet of width, if that's not properly maintained, it's really not going to be safe or comfortable, and people will have to tend to avoid that location, or if they can't, they end up being put in more compromised situations. And I'll note that Federal Highway, even back into the early 2000s, was already saying that the desirable width for a sidewalk is often much greater than what's required. In shopping districts, it can require 12, 20, 30, and even 40 feet of width to handle the volumes of pedestrian traffic that they encounter. And it's stated explicitly sidewalk widths have not been given sufficient attention by most designers. So as we were developing the Ohio Multimodal Design Guide, we were looking at not only what are the appropriate widths of like the starting point of widths for a sidewalk based on context, but also what are the appropriate widths of the buffers along those sidewalks to make them more safe and comfortable. Another thing that's important from a safety perspective is developing the public spaces in a more inviting way. The inclusion of things like street furniture, landscaping, and pedestrian scale lighting can make a big difference in making a street more inviting, increasing that pedestrian activity. And then when you have that pedestrian activity, drivers are more aware of the fact that they're going to encounter pedestrians on the street. It's that safety in numbers principle that can be applied by making a street more inviting. So this is Denison, Texas. You can see we did have to narrow up the roadway to create some of the space for these amenities, but that really does change the character of what the street looks like. I will note you don't see a lot of pedestrians because this was a photo taken during construction, but these types of designs really do matter. This is Inman Square in Cambridge, Mass. This was able to create a space as part of a street reconfiguration that also affected the safety of the street users. Shared use path width, similar to sidewalk width, really needs to be thought through when it comes to the safety of those users on those paths. Historically, we've been doing shared use paths at the bare minimum 10-foot wide, when at least 11 feet is really needed to accommodate somebody riding side by side and people passing. And we know that people flock to these locations to get their exercise, get that socialization. And what tends to happen, we build at the bare minimum and we get photos like the bottom right, where it's ultimately so congested that it almost becomes unusable by the wide range of users going at different speeds in these different volumes. And so what the AASHTO Bike Guide tries to point out is that we need to be selecting values for these widths based on the anticipated use. Here's an example from Columbus, Ohio, where the widths are very clearly wider than what we were seeing in some of those other photos. It allows people to bike side by side. It would also allow pedestrians to walk side by side and really creates a more inviting, more comfortable, and safer environment. I also want to point out the importance of the shy distances from the things along a path. So very clearly here, both the guardrail and the railing along the side are offset from that path to really make it truly functional. Here's another example from Albuquerque, New Mexico on the Albuquerque Rail Trail. This is a brand new trail, and the default starting point for width was 14 feet to accommodate that diverse group of and variety of different types of users. I'll also note that projects like this that incorporate those public art components and latch onto the history of the corridor also can help to make it a little more inviting. Pro tip, if you do visit Albuquerque and go to this trail, these amazing sculptures over the path, each one casts a different type of shadow on the path, so look out for that. Next, let's focus on intersection safety. When we were developing the bike guide, we flagged these as the 6 things that we need to be doing at intersections, and it's really applicable to both pedestrians and bicyclists when it comes to the safety perspective. So minimizing exposure, reducing the speeds of vehicles at those conflict points, communicating who has the right of way and that everybody can see one another, and then making sure that transitions between facilities are intuitive and the needs of people with disabilities are being addressed. One good example of where that's been done is, again, the Inman Square project in Cambridge. This is the before condition. You can see huge conflict areas for bicyclists. You can see long crossing distances for pedestrians, and not all of the pedestrian desire lines are provided. And here's what that street looks like today. You can see that plaza that I talked about before in the upper right. We were able to repurpose a lot of public space and focus the design on safety, making it a lot more intuitive, reducing those pedestrian crossing distances. And where we had to, relying on things like signalization, to separate the motor vehicles from the pedestrian and bicyclist traffic. So when we talk about minimizing vehicle speeds, that's a really important thing that we need to be doing on our streets. We need to focus on what are the vehicles that we actually need to use as our design vehicle, and what are the vehicles that we simply have to accommodate, and then alter the design to meet those needs. And one important thing to recognize is when you construct a corner at an intersection, the constructed radius is not always the path that the motor vehicle takes. And more often than not, like the photo on the right here, is that the effective turning radius, which is what's going to control the speed, is often much larger than the constructed radius. So curb extensions can help with that. Protected intersections can further help with that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, what are the appropriate vehicles that we need to be accommodating on those streets? Too often, I'm told on a project that, oh, we have to accommodate the large tractor trailer at each one of these intersections. Is that actually true? Is that the vehicle that's frequently making that maneuver? Or is it something that's really only occasionally happening and really doesn't need to be the design vehicle for that location? So the Los Angeles Supplemental Street Design Guide is a good example of highlighting that if it's local streets, it's by and large the Amazon truck or the FedEx truck. Those are the most frequent larger vehicles using those streets. Yes, we still need to accommodate the trash truck once a week and those occasional large vehicles. But as long as we have the pavement for that to work, it'd be much better to design it for those smaller vehicles as the default user. Does the corner radius actually matter? I could tell you this mother and her child, it very much mattered. This is a location that has a large constructed radius, and because we have two receiving lanes on that intersecting street, that white vehicle was able to make that turn quite quickly. Everybody can see that the conflict is happening, but the vehicle's traveling too fast to be able to react. By comparison, an intersection that's designed with a small corner radius forces a turning vehicle to make that turn more slowly. These are effective strategies at addressing safety and should be deployed more frequently on each and every one of our intersections. And it doesn't have to always be in concrete. We can retrofit our streets to meet these needs today. This is a good example from Detroit, Michigan that I encountered, where a sort of quick build curb extension was used to tighten up that location and force drivers to make that turn a little more slowly. We're seeing this across the country. The Philadelphia Slow Zones Initiative is using bump out curb extensions to alter the corner radii. Here in Pittsburgh, that was another example of not only doing some lane narrowing and some corner changes, but also doing some chicaning to affect motor vehicle speeds on those corridors. Here's another example from Falls Church, Virginia. And here you could see there's not even a pedestrian crossing going left to right, but introducing that curb extension not only is going to affect the speeds of turning vehicles, but often then creates the space for areas that are no longer impervious and opportunities for things like green street infrastructure or bioretention. But not all curb extensions are built alike. In this example here that I recently encountered, there was a safety project that was done. They installed lots of concrete in the middle of the street, but the curb extension on the right there has a 4-foot offset from the adjacent travel lane. It's minimally effective at addressing turning vehicle speeds and doesn't provide the benefits of things like shorter crossing distances for pedestrians. So it's not affecting the pedestrian exposure or the turning vehicles. Raised crossings are another one of those treatments that can control vehicle speeds. We can deploy these things not just at intersections, but also at driveways to further reinforce that the crossing users have the priority while still accommodating the motor vehicles at those locations. Here's an example from Silver Spring, Maryland, where you can see the priority is maintaining the pedestrian traffic while still accommodating the vehicles turning there. By default, the city of Austin is using this type of treatment for all of their newly constructed separated bike lane projects. So if you look online at the city of Austin's interim standard details, you can see that detail on the left where we're introducing beveled curbs between the sidewalk and the separated bike lane, which again is going to help with pedestrian continuity. And we're not seeing vehicles bottoming out with these types of designs because we're incrementally stepping up that elevation. So really it comes back to altering the design guidance to a design that actually works and has been tested like this. Another example from the Ohio Multimodal Design Guide, their detail for raised crossings and speed tables drives home the point that past traffic calming guidance missed. It always said that the ramp up and the ramp down on these types of treatments needed to be 6 feet long. Well, that just means it's a static change in grade. What we highlighted in the multimodal design guide was that you should alter the length of that ramp and alter the change in grade based on what speed you want drivers to be able to navigate that. And we're seeing lots of agencies doing this just as a default policy. The state of Hawaii is doing tons of raised crossings to address safety. And as they said here, they don't have to wait for crashes to happen, and that they know that this is a strategy that works. So they're deploying them regularly. Here's another example from the Philadelphia Slow Zones program. And as you build these, it really empowers the agencies to know these are things that I can do and they work. Here's another example from Bainbridge Island, Washington, where it's including both of those things. It's both a raised crossing across the main road and a raised crossing across the adjacent driveway. And it's important because in this context, it's next to an elementary school and a middle school, and also serves as a connection to the Sound of Olympics Trail, as well as some park trails. So this is a location where we have vulnerable road users. Installing the infrastructure to address that is part of the conversation. While there are lots of tools we can use to affect driver behavior and driver speed, like curb extensions and medians, pedestrian refuges, etc., the one that I find the most compelling is probably mountable truck aprons. So anytime I'm doing an intersection corner that's more than 15 or 18-foot radius, I want to see a mountable truck apron to control those turning vehicle speeds. And there's even the first roundabout that I ever worked on was this one in Bordentown, Chesterfield Road in New Jersey. And it was being implemented as part of a safety project. And so even though we had to accommodate larger vehicles, we were incorporating mountable aprons on the approaches to these roundabouts to control the entering vehicular speeds. Note also the picture on the left. That mountable apron is only included on the downstream side past the crosswalk because we deliberately didn't want to confuse pedestrians into thinking that the area in line with the apron was a safe place to wait. So some designs you'll see it upstream of the crosswalk, others downstream. It just matters where's it going to be the most effective at controlling speeds. Another example from San Francisco. And one detail I like of this, even though this wouldn't work in a cold climate that needs to do snow plowing to have that vertical curb that you see, notice that it tapers off to a zero reveal on the downstream side. That's going to work really well in a cold climate because when you're plowing it, it's not going to deposit snow off the backside of the apron. Another example from Texas at an on-ramp. This location in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at a protected intersection, incorporating those mountable treatments while really narrowing up the intersection crossing. And we can do it quick build too. Silver Spring, Maryland is using these segmental treatments often used for modular roundabouts. And here they're using them as a mountable apron. And the leader of the pack was probably New York City when they were deploying these speed bump type treatments, often referred to as corner wedges or turn wedges, and deploying them regularly around the city to address turning vehicle speeds. There's a lot of good construction details. If your agency doesn't have them, we included those in the Ohio Multimodal Design Guide. So there's this configuration of it, as well as the one that we referred to as a truck pillow. Slip lanes are another one that needs to be altered to address safety. So the example on the left is the way a lot of slip lanes had been constructed in the past. What FHWA's guidance and also what we included in the bike guide is showing that long, skinny tail type approach of the channelized right turn lanes. This not only better addresses the vehicular speeds, but also makes it safer for drivers as they try to turn right onto those adjacent streets. So again, this isn't just a pie in the sky idea. These are things that are being implemented. So the Fulton and Bancroft intersection in the Berkeley, California project, that included that type of geometry and includes both pedestrian and bicyclist crossings of those slip lanes. Intermediate level separated bike lanes, also a great tool for addressing safety, as well as addressing pedestrian accessibility. If we just include a small mountable curb between the bikeway and the adjacent sidewalk, can really help to reinforce the difference of those two facilities and not encourage pedestrians to walk into those locations. So again, Austin, Texas is deploying those regularly. I'll also note that intermediate level designs also make it pretty easy to do grading at things like floating bus stops and make that transit accommodation a little better for pedestrians. Protected intersections, a clear concept that works well not just for separated bike lanes, but also shared use paths along roadways. The key features there being that corner island that's going to slow the turning vehicle and having an offset from the adjacent roadway. So the research has shown us that an offset of 6 to 16 and a half feet from the adjacent roadway is more likely to get that motorist yielding. The first one I ever worked on was St. Paul, Minnesota, but there have been plenty constructed around the country. Here's another one from Austin, Texas. The Berkeley project included a protected intersection. You can see here, it's not even a very large corner island that's needed, but it is effective at controlling the speeds. And Seattle, Washington has quite a few of the really good designs for protected intersections. And here it's even doing that center median in the middle of the road to really narrow up the roadway widths and make the vehicular turning paths more predictable. And you don't just need to do this if you have a separated bike lane. You can convert conventional bike lanes to a separated bike lane at an intersection. And that's actually the preferred recommendation from NCHRP 1125, highlighting that that's the preferred design for both safety and comfort. Obviously, we have the FHWA steps guide to identify what countermeasures work well for a mid-block crossing, and you'll see similar guidance in the AASHTO bike guide, focusing on markings, rapid flashing beacons, or pedestrian hybrid beacons and signalization. Safety at night needs to be a major focus of our investment in infrastructure because nighttime crashes is where we're seeing the greatest number of pedestrian fatalities. That was highlighted in the recently released NCHRP 1157. And what that study identified was the key to addressing safety at night is reducing vehicular speeds, enhancing visibility, and reducing a pedestrian's exposure within the roadway. So what are the countermeasures that work well for that? You can see the top ones here are the reallocation, the speed limit setting, and enforcement, because that's what's going to ultimately affect vehicular speeds. Yes, lighting and other treatments are still part of the equation, but we have to alter the speeds to really get those safety benefits. When it comes to the lighting, specifically located spotlighting, particularly locating them in advance of a crossing, so a pedestrian is front illuminated, is most likely to be the most successful. But the study was very clear, lighting alone will not increase pedestrian safety substantially. Instead, we need to alter the speeds of vehicles to have a significant impact on pedestrian safety at night. Sort of closing out here, I don't want to miss out on rural areas and rural safety for pedestrians. One of the treatments that's quite interesting is advisory shoulders. They are technically experimental, so you need a request to experiment from Federal Highway if deploying them. But that said, they do have a crash modification factor and have been shown to better address safety on those types of roadways. You can look that up under the title Edge Lane Roads. And again, these aren't pie in the sky ideas. They are being implemented around the country. This is an example for Maine as well as New Hampshire. And I'll close out with something that's a little less physical in nature. Despite what you may have heard, aesthetic surface treatments are still permitted by the manual on traffic control devices. And situations like what's shown here, those areas outside of the edge lines aren't actually part of the street anymore. They're part of the sidewalk. And so we have a lot of flexibility that we can deploy there. The Bloomberg study that was done in 2022 did look at both crash statistics as well as user behavior and found that these types of treatments can have a benefit in reducing crashes and improving motorist yield rates. So on the left, there's an older example from Denver, and on the right is a newer example from Memphis, where those markings were installed outside of pedestrian areas to help make it a little easier for people with vision disabilities to navigate those locations. Honestly, there was a lot of content that I could have presented to you. I could have touched on hardened center lines and refuge medians, speed setting policies, roundabouts, accessible shared streets, and curbless and flush streets, as well as a lot of other traffic calming type elements and signalization strategies. But I'd rather hear what you all want to talk about. So thanks for listening, and let's dig into what questions you have.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was great. And I guess I've been following along with the Q&A in the chat. There's a ton of questions. People love digging into the details of street design. There's something about that, really gets some people, including dedicated amateurs like me, as opposed to professionals like you. The first thing I want to say is just use my prerogative here. Thank you for bringing up safer vehicles. I'd urge people to take a look at our safer vehicles campaigns we're working on. And one of the things that we've been advocating is that city governments and state governments purchase safer vehicles for themselves and require in their contracts that their contractors use safer vehicles. There's a lot that can be done there. So I want to thank you for that. And then I think, one of the other questions was about, how do you deal with the traffic? And so we'll launch with that one. How do you deal with the traffic engineer citing either the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices or the AASHTO Green Book, who says we can't do something different? And I think that one of the takeaways from this, and one of the things I really appreciate about your presentation is other people are doing it is one of the answers and following those guidelines. But I'll throw it to you to give me an answer on that one. What do you do with but you can't do that. How do you deal with the engineer who's already decided he doesn't like what you're doing and he's going to use the manual as a defense?
I mean, I push back because it's not what the manual says. The manual is a guide, and it yes, it has tables that have clear numbers that are identified. And if you just look at that table, you would think that's what I have to do. But there's a lot of text associated with that table as well. And when you dig into that text, it talks about a lot of the things that I was mentioning here and gives you a lot of that flexibility to make an informed decision of what's appropriate. It is not prescriptive, and it's not meant to be prescriptive. Similarly, when I look at things like the MUTCD, there are standard statements in there and there are guidance statements in there, and they should not be interpreted as the same thing. The one challenge that I encounter more than I would like is that many agencies have taken pieces of the design guidance in something like the Green Book and encapsulated them into their own statewide or their own agency's design guidance, and sometimes made it more restrictive than what the Green Book intended. I'd also add that AASHTO is in the process right now of updating the Green Book to better address context-sensitive design and really drive these points home even more. But even today, the way it's written, it still allows for that type of flexibility. So yeah, I point to examples where it's been done, and I also point to the actual words in the guide to say this is allowed.
I would say to an advocate when you are told that is could you I would ask the engineer or whoever is giving you that information, could you show me where it says that?
Hmm.
Starting
The
point.
another thing with the Astro guides is they're not publicly available and they are quite expensive. So from the advocacy perspective, if they're not available in your library, seeing if they can be purchased for your library so that you have access to the same information as the engineers could go a long way.
And sometimes you'll find that when you ask that question, they may be citing to something that's old and out of date, right? It's a practice that they used to have, but that's or the practice that used to be approved and no longer. Or you may be able to read it yourself, as Jeremy's proposing, or you may be able to look at it and go online and take a look at, for example, nacto.org, see what they say about the same exact thing.
Hmm.
So there are debates within the profession about what is or is not safe. And there are actually a lot of change and evolution of design standards over the last number of years, which maybe that engineer just isn't up to date. So
And FHWA has said guidance like that from NACDO is perfectly acceptable to use, as are the local agencies that are developing their own complete streets design guidance and local design guidance that really touches on the context of their community. All of those are perfectly okay to use. So I borrow from stuff all across the country. I'm lucky enough to be exposed to it all on our projects, but there's no reason that you can't borrow from another community and see how their design guidance is written.
I
Abdullah, over to
no, I
you.
love this. And that the first set of questions that were coming in were about this topic. So it looks like you have covered most of that. I just want to maybe highlight and give you another maybe one more opportunity, Jeremy, to talk about the tools and tactics that advocates who maybe engineers or not engineers can use when they are talking to engineers who tell them like, nope, this is how it is. This road needs to be wider. What else? What other tactics can they use to other than just trying to study? Especially, I'm more mindful and thinking about someone who might not have the engineering background but has big heart and want to make their community safer.
Hmm. Well, I think the first thing that they can do is get involved in the process of identifying what the goals of the project are and getting involved in the public engagement part where what are we trying to achieve is being discussed, because that ultimately is what can and should drive a lot of the decision making. And so if we can point back to the goal that says safety is the number one goal, well then that gives us the flexibility to reduce some of those lane widths or make specific design choices that are going to have that outcome. Um, that's a big driving force of a lot of projects. And if we can get that scope right, that project goals list right, it makes it a lot easier to tackle that.
I did not give Abdullahi the props he deserved as in the introduction. Abdullahi's a urban planner. He's worked for the Minnesota Department of Transportation. He has his own consulting firm now, which works on community outreach on these issues, and has also been, like me, an elected official who has stood in front of people from the community on both sides of some of these issues, objecting to a proposed change or objecting to a current street design because it's not safe enough. So we're
Yeah.
really glad to have Abdullahi here with us. The next major question that came up, and I'll throw it to you, multiple people asked it, was about 20 feet of clear space for fire trucks. And so for anybody who asked the question, I also threw into the chat a NACDO study on best practices for emergency vehicles. But I'll throw it to Jeremy on that one. How do you deal with that one? What's your experience?
It's an arbitrary number that's encapsulated in an appendix of the International Fire Code, and I hear it a lot. Some agencies have gone so far as to eliminate that appendix from their governing laws. So that was something that the city of Baltimore had to do to deal with a very contentious project. But others have worked with their fire departments and with the fire chief to really understand what is the space you need and where do you need it, and identify a more tailored approach to street design. One good example of that has the Montgomery County, Maryland, as part of their suite of complete streets guidance. So they have their complete streets guide, they have an accessibility design guide, they have a shared and accessible streets guide. And then there's also a component that is emergency services, and it touches on where do we actually need that extra width? How do we provide that space where it's needed near the hydrants or near buildings that necessitate those larger apparatus being deployed? And where don't we need all of that width? I think that sets a really good example of a collaborative approach with the emergency services involved in the discussion. I've had similar discussions in like the city of Portland, Oregon, when talking about their separated bike lanes implementation and safety projects. We met with the fire chief and asked, like, is this an issue? Is this an issue? And found solutions that would work. Sacramento is similarly going through a process of developing some new design guidance. And we talked not only with emergency services, but also the sanitation department to understand what space do they need to do the trash and recycling collection. All of that should be part of the discussion of street design and not left as an afterthought. Bringing those people in early ultimately ends up with a much better design in the end.
I will add a little bit to this, and we face the same issue in Seattle. The grim statistics are that deaths on streets and injuries on streets due to unsafe street design is vastly exceeds across the country and in city by city the number of deaths from fires and the number of injuries from fires. So it's like I said, it's a grim statistic, but the insistence on the 20-foot wide clear zone or wide lanes or large corner radii is dangerous and more dangerous than the risk of the amount of time it takes a fire truck to reach a place. And it may look for other changes of fire practices, in terms of what size vehicles they use and things like that, which may be more appropriate. In my own experience in Seattle when I was mayor, most of the street grid was built to a certain lane width, curb to curb. There was parking both sides. So you had an effective travel lane of about 13 feet. Two cars couldn't even pass each other. That's most residential streets in the city. And Seattle has a great fire department with great response time. So the point of it being arbitrary is on point. It's an arbitrary number that's actually a very unsafe number. So
And you look at older cities, they don't have that width. They never have, and they're not going to knock down the buildings to create the width. They still find ways of getting the fire apparatus where it needs to get to and dealing with emergencies when they occur.
And that was exactly what our fire chief said to me when pressed. He said, "We will get our equipment to the fire," is what he said. So they can work with it, and so the standard is arbitrary, but it's a big obstacle as noticed.
It is
raising it. Abdullahi.
Yes, there's one that is close to home because I live just outside of Minneapolis, New Brighton here, outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul. This question's about that snow emergency, snow operations. A lot of these corner islands and bed refuge island designs do not seem to account for snow removal and storage. Did this come up in the process in the St. Paul, Minnesota example, and how was it resolved?
Yeah, I mean, snow removal, again, it comes back to having those conversations early in the project to understand what do they need in order to do that snow clearing. Right now, we're working with Wisconsin DOT and developing multimodal design guidance for them. And obviously, Wisconsin gets a heck of a lot of snow. And so It means making slight alterations to little design details to make that work well. So what I was talking about on that California mountable truck apron, you're not going to have a vertical curb, but if you make that a mountable sloping curb, well, that's no different than every roundabout in the US. It has a mountable curb. They can be plowed. I have videos to prove it. So it's not a problem. But tapering that off on the downstream side, it's a little detail that can really matter a lot to make that snow clearing easier. Um, when we were talking about the design of the Jackson Street project in St. Paul, that was part of the discussion around the width of the facility for the bikes in that instance was they wanted to be able to drive a pickup truck with a plow on it down that facility for clearing snow. So the width of that plow was what was driving some of those design choices. It made it better from a space to accommodate that vulnerable road user. But yeah, having some of that discussion right up front and establishing that framework ultimately led to a better outcome.
We have a couple of different questions that speak to disability access, and so I'll just combine them into one question. I suppose the first one is just how do you incorporate that in? Um, the more specifically, a concern about roundabouts being unsafe for blind users, as well as floating bus lanes, ones where there's a sidewalk for people listening. There's a sidewalk, then there's a bike lane, and then the bus lane is on the other side of the bike lane from the sidewalk, allowing the bus to stop in lane. So
Mhm.
those two specific comments were raised about safety for blind users and I'll just generalize it, incorporating disability guidelines into the work and how that's done. That's
It's super important and it's required by law. The ADA requires streets to be accessible to people with disabilities, and regardless of what design guidance does or doesn't exist, we're still required to do that. So it's something that we incorporate into all of our projects. And I think it's important where there isn't clear design guidance that you are engaging people with those types of various disabilities in the process. And I'd further highlight that guidance like PROAG from the Access Board is really more focused on people with vision and mobility disabilities, hearing as well. But it's not addressing what's needed for people with developmental or cognitive disabilities. But that is something that we are working with various agencies to address that as part of the design process. Again, pointing to the Montgomery County, Maryland Complete Streets suite of tools. They have a very clear, accessible design guide that does address some of the other tactile treatments that can be used at things like floating bus stops to help somebody, one, find that, and then two, get across the facility. What you saw in that Austin floating bus stop example, that's an intermediate level bike lane until it gets to the pedestrian crossing. And then there's a basically small raised crossing for the bicyclist to traverse. So from a pedestrian perspective, it's all one flush surface to cross from the sidewalk to the bus island. And the vertical change in elevation helps to serve as a speed control for those crossing bicyclists. There is, though, still ongoing research on all of these topics. I'm not going to remember the exact number. I think it's B51 is a research project looking at some of these vision disability issues. And there's another set of NCHRP studies right now that's ongoing on these topics. I expect some of this will continue to evolve. But from a safety perspective on the roundabout piece, it's not the single lane roundabouts that tend to be the problems. It's the higher speed multi-lane roundabouts that are a real issue. And so relying not just on what's the bare minimum, so PROAG requires us to do one of four different types of treatments. There are many instances where doing more of those treatments at the location would be more beneficial at addressing safety.
Thank you, Jeremy. We have ton of questions related to street design and public space. We'll start with one that had multiple people asking about, and it goes like this. Have you looked into the same side traffic signals or signals on the same side of the approach as drivers? The MUTCD doesn't have much guidance, but Europe and other places around the world use them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, mostly I've been using near side signals for things like bicyclists, because you can do a smaller signal head on the near side that's more better positioned to their visibility and their height. I haven't really done that for vehicular approaches, though there are instances where, from a sightline or visibility perspective, doing it near side can be beneficial.
I just want you to know, Jeremy, since you've not been tracking the questions, we have 60 open questions
Oh boy.
in the
I
chat.
guess we're
I
gonna have to
know.
extend this another couple hours.
We probably would. And I really, I'm mentioning that because I really do, you know, there's so many specific questions that are being asked in the chat. It's really giving me a message about, from America Walks, about the hunger for this type of information. And I'm not going to ask you today, but I'm thinking, man, do we need another webinar that's just let's do this again, but with more Q&A. But what would be good resources then for the person out there, and maybe the casual user? I'm going to promote. We have a Designing Streets for Safety, but it's incomplete. It's only a certain number. I've also mentioned NACTO several times. The National Association of City Traffic Officials puts out guidelines, but and I'm just speaking from my own perspective. There is actually a tremendous number of resources online about these topics. I think this used to be something that was the province of trained experts, but with the explosion, I'm old enough to say this, but with the explosion of the internet and resources there, there's actually a ton of information out there from a variety of sources where people can become more educated about the details of design as well. But I'll throw it to Jeremy and Abdullahi as well, where to get further information. And to everybody that's not going to get a question answered in this 60 minutes today, I hear you. We're going to think about how to continue to provide this because the questions you ask matter. And I'll also just say, if you have a project you're working on, check out America Walk, see what resources we have already available to help you. We are here to help local people on street safety projects. It's one of the things we really care about doing. So I'll throw it to Jeremy and then Abdullahi, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, and NACTO provides great resources, and beyond the resources that they publish, they always have excellent footnotes that identify where they're getting their information from. So actually pointing you to the research or the previous NCHRP projects. I recognize NCHRP is a little technical, but I find it super helpful to understand the state of the practice when it comes to transportation. And even if you're an advocate, then you don't want to read the multi-hundred page reports that they put out through that process. There is always an executive summary or some very clear conclusions that came out of that research that can be really interesting and easy to digest. And those are freely available resources. I'd also look to see what the consultants that work on these types of projects are posting on their social media accounts. I mean, we often highlight the design guidance that we're working on or what's recently published, and many of the other firms that I work with and respect do similar things. So that does help you to keep your finger on the pulse of what's new and what's fresh and who updated something recently that you should be aware of.
I want to amplify that. Toole does put out awesome general purpose materials for people, as do other professionals in the field, and it's often great stuff. And it's also a great place to look for, of course, design firms love to highlight the great work that they've done. So it's also a great place to find examples of good work being done someplace else that you could bring into your community as well. Abdullahi, any final thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you so much on behalf of America Walks, which I sit on the board. We really appreciate your time and thoughtful questions. And we would like to please help us thank Jeremy as well for spending time with us and expertise and resources. This is wonderful work that takes all of us. And we really appreciate all of you. Thank you.
And one final word from me. While this webinar series is promoted by CDC and funded by them, and for which we are tremendously grateful because of the health implications of walkability, our ability to answer those individual questions, to give you that personal staff time, to have the capacity to get all of this out there is dependent upon support from individual donors as well. It's a critical piece of the puzzle, particularly in these times when some major funding sources are becoming more constrained. So I see the hunger out there in these questions. I see the awesome work being done by thousands of advocates around the country. If you've benefited from these webinars in the past or from our resources, or you care about our mission and what we're trying to do, please, americawalks.org/donate. We need your dollars. And so that our wonderful staff, including Madeline behind the America Walks symbol there, can continue getting this information out to the public so we can have safer streets for all. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.